welcome our speakers on stage. It's going to be, for those of you who are here this morning, it's going to be a different conversation than what we had this morning. But what we have in common is we have three amazing women who are going to talk about their work and their views on the worker rights movement and organizing and how we talk about it in the media. So I'm really excited for this conversation. The plan is for me to ask a couple of questions to all of the speakers so that they can introduce themselves a little bit more, and then they're going to ask each other questions. And then we're going to hopefully have some time in the last few minutes to take audience questions. So think about questions that you have, and we'll pass mics. And you know, if we run out of time, if you want to write down your questions, it's interesting for us to know the kinds of questions you had. So you're welcome to share those with us too. But we're going to try to make time. So are our speakers ready to make their way up to the stage? Tammy Kim is standing up first. Tammy Kim is a magazine reporter and a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, among many other accomplishments. And I encourage you to read everyone's bios because they're all very impressive. And then following her onto the stage is Kim Kelly, who is an organizer, and she writes the labor column at Teen Vogue magazine, and she writes other columns and is a freelance writer. And she has a very interesting background and set of interests. And then Ashley Jenkins, closest to me, is the assistant organizing director with ASME. So we have actually a great mix of people who can talk about organizing and how we talk about organizing in the media. And it looks like I need to be a little bit closer to the microphone. Thank you, Jenny. All right, so let me grab this. And join everyone on stage. And the first question I wanted to ask was we can start with Tammy, was to invite you to, we can read their bios, a little bit about the sort of top line of their work lives. But I would love for you to share what was your first paid job and what did you learn about working?
Hi everyone, thanks so much for having me. My first job was working at the Gap as a floor salesperson, like probably many of you, maybe in a suburban mall. And the lesson of that job actually was that they make you watch corporate propaganda videos. So that was my first taste of kind of like anti-union and pro-corporate messaging and kind of what that meant.
Great. How about you, Kim?
Hey guys, thanks for being here. My first job was as a dishwasher at a family restaurant a few towns over, which was terrible. And what I learned was that you can never trust the boss, which has definitely served me well over the ensuing, decade or two.
Oh, and before I ask Ashley, Kim said she posed this question on Twitter, and I think you're a very active Twitter user, and you said you got a bunch of responses.
Very online.
So people may want to check. Did they replied to you?
Yeah, there's like 700 responses.
Yeah. So you may want to check that out too, see what other people said. Ashley, how about you?
Hello. So my first job was as a front desk representative for the Marriott, and that's been my only job outside of labor. And so what it taught me, or what I learned from that job, is that watching our housekeepers perform the work that they did was that workers don't just want a union for wages to make more money, but they want to improve the actual conditions that they're working in. And so seeing that firsthand, I actually used that experience as my interview questions to get into labor as an organizer in training. So they produced, I think, one of the best labor organizers they could have ever done.
Great. Cindy, I hope you don't have to keep texting me to move the mic closer to my face, and then I can actually maintain this distance. So getting into, thank you all for sharing those experiences. So I wanted to get into the specifics of your different areas of work, and I'm going to start with you, Kim. The way I first became aware of you was reading your column in Teen Vogue and being like, what? Teen Vogue is writing about this? And I'm sure you get that question a lot.
2019 is wild.
So I'd just love to hear a little bit more about how did this come about, that you became the labor columnist for Teen Vogue, and then if you have more to say on engagement of young people, however you define young people.
Right, yeah. Honestly, I'm as surprised as you are. I came out of the music industry. I've been a heavy metal journalist for about 15 years, which seems to be something that nobody knows anymore. That was my whole life. And so I was just a heavy metal journalist for all over the place. I was working at Vice as their editor, as a heavy metal editor, when we started organizing. And that is, up until that point, I hadn't really written about that much else. Like, I was always interested in labor and leftist politics, working class struggle, just on my own time, because of my own politics, my own experiences. But it wasn't until I got involved in the organizing and bargaining and forever, ever meetings effort at Vice that I felt like I was coming from a place where I had that knowledge and sort of had a right to cover this stuff. You know, I'm from a union family. I'm from, working class, middle of nowhere, South Jersey. My family were all construction workers and factory workers. So I had a very early and deep understanding what a union was, and I just never really thought I'd get a chance to be a part of one until we came to Vice and we organized with the Writers Guild of America East. And yeah, right? I'm on the council too, can you believe it? And in terms of getting started at Teen Vogue, I always freelanced because Vice didn't pay me very well, and I had a lot of other interests. And in about 2017, I just cold pitched them a couple pieces on prison industrial complex stuff. So I started out writing some things for them about prisons. And at one point, I pitched them a profile of Mother Jones. So I thought, hey, your readers are mostly young non-male people. They might respond to this. And my editor said, yeah, that sounds cool, but I'm not sure our readers will know what a union is. And I was like, oh, fair, okay. Why don't you just do an explainer of that? I was like, okay, so I did that, and that kind of took off in a way I wasn't expecting, because I guess people weren't really anticipating, what is a union and how does it work piece coming from Teen Vogue in 2017. And that picked up, and I did a few more pieces like that for them, and at one point, they actually won a Sidney Hillman Award for their social justice reporting, and in the write-up for that, it mentioned my piece, so I saw that, and I was like, okay. And I hit them up, I was like, you guys should just give me a regular column. And they're like, well, yeah, okay, why not? And it's been a year and a half, 2 years, and they let me get away with a lot. And it's a really good opportunity to connect with a younger audience that maybe doesn't know that they should be reading In These Times or labor notes. It's in terms of connecting with these younger readers, I just try to approach it from a place of understanding that maybe just because you need to explain something or break it down a little more doesn't mean you're dumbing it down. It just means you're making it more accessible for the people that need it most.
Yeah. Thanks, Kim. Tammy, you write about a lot of issues. You write about labor issues, culture, housing, the Koreas, other things too. And I think we're going to have some photos that Tammy's going to reflect on and talk about a little bit. So I'm just curious, how does having this wide-ranging portfolio influence how you approach writing about worker issues?
Well, I prepared a couple slides, mostly so you don't have to look at me on a large screen, but I thought I'd just talk through them to kind of explain how I see the interconnectedness of the various things that I've been working on. Coming to this NELP conference for me is a little bit of a homecoming, because I know some of you guys from when I was an attorney at the Community Development Project of the Urban Justice Center, serving the members of worker centers. And that experience politicized me and really changed my life. Also because when we were at Urban Justice Center, we unionized with the same union that represents NELP, Knowles. And so I had my first experience of kind of seeing myself as part of the movements that I was representing and interacting with. So I just wanted to show you a couple of these photos. Oh no, I'm on the screen, okay. So when I retired as a lawyer and became a journalist, I felt like it was a really great opportunity to tell kind of a wider range of stories and to use language in a different way than I had been as an advocate. And that's put me in contact with home care workers. So this is a story I did on 24-hour home care in New York, which Caitlin Connolly of NELP was an expert for. Yeah. Slide, please. I've been able to cover the teacher strikes, which we haven't heard too much about at this conference, but of course is part of this wave. We're in this incredible moment. I was touched when Rebecca earlier this morning talked about this thought experiment of, what if the New Deal hadn't gone the way it did in this exclusionary way? And what if we'd kind of let things get a little bit worse to something else? And what is the way in which we can envision other futures? and without going like full accelerationist, like, oh, let's just let it all collapse so we can build something new. I think there is something obviously going on in our society right now where there's so many sectors organizing, and of course you guys are the leaders of that. But the teacher strikes, I think, have really fueled a lot of conversation across society. Slide, please. And then, and the GM strike as well. Slide, please. And to Nayantara's point about, how work influences other fields of study or coverage, this is from a story that I did on immigrant workers and TPS. And of course, the immigrant rights movement is super closely tied into work. Slide, please. It's also true for public transit and climate change. Slide, please. Or even public education and what we're seeing now, which I think is a fundamental reevaluation of public goods. Like, what do we need to survive? Like, what do we want our government to look like and to provide so that everyone can have a decent life? This is like all part of the labor movement conversation. Slide, please. And as Nayantara mentioned, I also do some international coverage. So I'm from a working class Korean immigrant family, and you guys have probably heard a little bit more about the Koreas under our current president. There's been some heat with a certain part of the Korean peninsula, but that's led me to engage more and to travel there to cover the social movements and the labor movement there. And so this is a photo that I took of the Me Too movement exploding in Korea, which has been supported by labor there. Slide, please. Also, the anti-imperialist movement there, because we operate the largest US overseas base in South Korea, home to 30,000 troops. Slide, please. And then just to echo Kim's point, I've organized with my coworkers at two different journalism shops, Al Jazeera America, RIP, it's gone, and then the New Yorker magazine, which is pictured here. And just wanted to share that when we started organizing, thanks, yeah. So when we started organizing at the New Yorker with the News Guild, which is part of CWA, there was a lot of chatter of, these are really elite journalists, they're super well educated, they're gonna think unions are just for like factory workers, why would they ever get engaged with this? They're gonna think unions are beneath them. Well, that just wasn't true. And folks were super excited. Some of them didn't even know what a union was. And it made me think about the same conversation that we sometimes hear on the other end, which is, oh, immigrant workers, black workers, they're so vulnerable. Why would they ever want to organize? Well, if it doesn't work on the high educated end or the low wage end, then who the hell is it for? And I think what we've learned in the last few years is that it's for everybody. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Tammy. So Ashley, I have a question for you, but I also know you have a short video. So if we could watch that and then we can reflect on it.
Employees in the state correctional system became the first to file for union recognition since winning collective bargaining rights. Workers will now be members of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, or AFSCME. A correctional sergeant says today's filing was a big deal.
We've been working diligently the last year, but I know that we've been doing this for a good 5, 6, 7 years. I mean, for a long time we've been trying to get collective bargaining. So to see it come to fruition now is amazing. It's exciting, and we're looking forward to the future with AFSCME for sure.
The union will rep thousands of state employees in Nevada. After the filing, the units will select bargaining teams to negotiate a contract with Nevada in the coming months.
And of course, everyone probably knows, especially those of you who were here yesterday morning for the plenary, we had an AFSCME member speaking about working on the campaign, the state level policy campaign here in Nevada. And so Ashley worked on that. Probably more accurate to say Ashley led on that. And so I'm curious to hear reflection on that, but also just your reflections on what kind of media coverage is helpful, both during a campaign and after a campaign, and how you kind of think about keeping media attention on.
So just thinking about media coverage of the campaigns, both during and after, it's very important that we have so much information about, just big union, big labor, and this anti-worker media coverage that always gets like the quick sound bites and things of that nature. But for us, it's like really taking a step back and focusing on who is the union, right? They're workers. Stephanie Dubé was here yesterday, who's a custodial worker from UNLV. And a couple of months ago, there was a big explosion at UNR in one of the dormitories there where the people that was injured, it wasn't the students, it was the workers there. It was our custodial workers, it was our electricians. It was the people that really helped to make sure that the campus ruin goes smoothly for the students while they're at school. That didn't make it to the news, right? When the correction officers that you just saw here are unionizing and trying to form their union, most of the time it's about they want more wages, as I said earlier. But what doesn't get coverage is why, right? Where these workers who come in to work and work 12 hours and then are mandated to work an additional 8 hours, that's 16 hours that I've been mandated to work and then to come back to work the next day, right? And I'm constantly mandated to work these hours. Or where, you know, there's not the training that the officers actually need to be able to produce a better, you know, stay for the inmates that are there and to be able to actually provide the care if someone's sick, who's taking this inmate to the hospital and things of those natures. So like really focusing on in the media who the workers are, why they're organizing, and then the impact of the workers organizing, like what that's actually gonna do to the communities that they serve. Most of our workers are public servants. So when the public servants are better able to advocate for services for the public is the biggest benefactor of the workers actually forming their union. And I think that's the story that doesn't get covered enough in the media.
So I'm actually going to turn it back to you to ask our media representatives on the stage some questions.
Yes, so one of my questions for Kim, speaking of, it's awesome that you have able to have a voice for the younger generation and those who typically don't even know what a union is. And what they hear a lot of times is that the union is this other entity that's coming into the workplace and it's going to change these things, or unions were great in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, that unions aren't, you know, no one needs a union now, right? We have all these things. So how do we as a labor organization make sure that we actually get the realness of what a union is and how workers are coming to form the union? Like how do we get that out more into the general public?
Like elevating workers' voices instead of just press releases.
Correct.
Which I get so many. Thank you. Please send me more. But like we were talking about at the table earlier, in terms of like press releases, very vital tool to reach out to journalists. And something that I always really appreciate when I get a press release from a union is when they have this, like, here's what's happening, here's a statement from an organizer, and here's what the people who are actually working, who are actually being impacted feel like. Like, here's what they think. I think putting the voices of workers directly in your union communications, I mean, it shows that we're all in this together. Nobody is above anybody else. Like, we're all working on this collectively, and that's really important, even just, you know, that's a baseline, right? And, I mean, I think that's the most important thing, right? Is showing that we're in this together, showing that it isn't the union doing something to workers. It is the workers who are taking action themselves with the support of a union, showing that they are the union. Like, it's because that's, like you're saying, there's a lot of, even when you're organizing a workplace, right? Like the classic playbook, oh, this third party is gonna come in and they're gonna mess things up, they're gonna ruin our little work family, which we know is hogwash, but if you don't have that, you know, that basis of education, you're gonna be like, oh, really? Oh, no. Because when we were at Vice, the only real pushback we got from, you know, my coworkers, it wasn't that they were anti-unions, but they didn't know what a union was. And they didn't know anybody who was in a union. Because, I mean, if you're working in New York media, in like certain circles, maybe your dad wasn't a factory worker. Maybe you're a nice kid who went to NYU. And that's fine. But, you know, there's things lacking there. And I think unions have, especially people that work in the communications department and who are working in social media, which is huge. Please hire like a millennial social media person. It matters a lot because labor journalists now, we are so online. Like, usually to the detriment of our brains, but also that's where we find stories, right? Like, I get most of my stories from either, I'll get texts, but I also follow tons of unions and worker centers on Twitter. I follow organizers. I follow specific workers. I get text messages. I get signal messages. I get DMs. It's relentless. I love it. But it's like there's a lot of different ways to get in touch with us and to show us like who we're fighting for. It's not like the union's doing this. It's these workers are doing this, and this is us telling you what's going on.
Thank you so much. And Tammy, I know that Kim just really talked about really like how do we get some of our stories out and messaging out, but like do you have any other best practices that we can use in story formation. I know here in Nevada we have hired, which is, we don't always have the luxury to hire like a local comms person, but because this is such a large campaign, we need a local comms person. But are there any other best practices for story formation?
Yeah, I think when you guys are all pitching journalists, it's probably, first of all, a good idea to know what the journalist writes about and to read some of their stuff to get a sense of whether it would fit. And then maybe kind of try to put yourself in the mind of a journalist. Like for us, we have to think about what form is the story going to take? Like, should it be an op-ed? Should it be a news story that's 800 words? Should it be a magazine story that's 2,000 words or 5,000 words? Should it be like a data visualization or a video? You know, there are all these different formats that obviously we all interact with every day. So I think kind of setting that up, like knowing who the journalist is and then thinking about like what the form of the story should be is a really good way to do the initial outreach to the reporter. And then of course you guys have reporters that you have already in your networks that you trust. And the other thing I would say is just, I guess, trust your members to speak, because sometimes there's a lot of hand-holding of members, which I totally get, because journalists are bad and scary, and generally it's not always great to talk to the media. But you know, I think the more access you can give, and like just let them kind of be themselves and tell their story, I think the better the story will be.
Thank you so much.
There's one thing, so we're talking about it. One other thing that I think is really going to be a useful resource is the fact that over the past 5 years, digital media has overwhelmingly become an organized industry. Like the Writers Guild of America East, my union, and also the News Guild have organized like 20 different publications. If you're looking for a writer or a publication that might be sympathetic to your story, just see who the union is representing. That the Writers Guild has a website all about digital media. I'm sure News Guild has the same. If you're looking for a place that you think, like, where can I find a writer that's sympathetic to this? Go to a unionized shop, because there's obviously going to be a base level of solidarity and a level of familiarity with the subject matter that's maybe somebody who hasn't gone through this process will have. But yeah, that's a little pro tip that I think you guys should look into.
Thank you both so much.
So Tammy, I want to let you ask Ashley and Kim a question too.
I wanted to start with Ashley. Ashley, journalists aren't PR people, right? Like we also have a job to do independent coverage and to point out things that may not always be positive about different campaigns and movements. And I'm wondering about how a journalist who, while sympathetic, still needs to do their job and wants to point out some of maybe the deficiencies or critiques of a campaign, how do you, as an organizer working with that journalist, you know, navigate that? Because it is important, I think, as a journalist, like for me to do that, but I also totally understand your guys' position of trying to fight the anti-union news.
Right, so we have been dealing a lot with that here in Nevada, being that they have not had collective bargaining ever, and it's kind of like the biggest thing for us in labor in the last 16 years. And so people want to always put out, the first question that they did here was like, well, how much is this gonna cost the public, right? If they're gonna get collective bargaining and union workers make more than those who are not unionized, like what does this mean to the budgets here and things of that nature? And so I think that that's important to ask those type of questions, but to be honest when given an answer, right? For workers here to actually pass collective bargaining, there's no cost, right? It's just the law and you passed it, but the way that the media spin it was once this law is passed, it's gonna put us in the whole $10 million just for passing the law, which is totally not true, right? And so I think asking those questions is important, but also just telling the other side of that, which was not done here. And so put the public at kind of panic, well, this isn't a great thing, we don't want this, the state's gonna go bankrupt and all those other things. And the other side of that is making sure that people know like the process for this, because even though the law is passed here, all of the units still have to be certified, and then a contract still has to be negotiated that the state has to approve and sign off on, right? And the reality is there's 20,000 state workers who this law will impact that all live here. So they're not gonna ultimately agree to pass something that's gonna bankrupt the state, right? And I think so just having that side of it, making sure that the workers still are a centerpiece of that story, right? That they live here, they work here, this is their community, and they're not gonna wanna pass something that's ultimately gonna harm the community at large.
Thank you. And for you, Kim. I was going to ask you, Kim, about navigating different audiences because you have columns in disparate publications, The New Republic, Baffler, Teen Vogue. So Kim has 3 labor columns right now. It's pretty impressive.
Send me tips.
Yeah. And so you already kind of talked about like trying to explain unions to people who don't know about unions. I was wondering if you could just expand on that a little bit and maybe given a couple examples about discussions you've had like with your editors maybe about like what you need to kind of not dumb down but like explain more or like what needs more like setup and explication as you're trying to convey these ideas to the public.
Yeah, I obviously have a little less of an issue at places like the New Republic or the Baffler that are kind of grounded in political, generally left-leaning, labor-friendly coverage. But the example that I'm thinking of at Teen Vogue, which I'm so glad that I got away with this. But so I did an explainer piece around the time that Boston Marriott workers were striking and some athletes crossed the picket line. And I wrote a piece about why you shouldn't do that. Like, what is a picket line? What does it mean? What does it mean to strike? Kind of a basic explainer with a timely news peg. And then a few months later, during the government shutdown, when AFA-CWA President Sarah Nelson called for us to think about the idea of a general strike, which was like freaking huge, right? Like, we haven't really been talking like that since way before I was born or my parents were born. And I told my editor, like, hey, you should let me do an explainer on what is a general strike. And she was like, oh, well, we just did a strike one. I'm like, no. This is, no, but this is, trust me, this is a different animal. Like, please, like, do me a solid. Like, trust me, let me write this piece. And then I wrote that piece, and it came out right around the time that all this conversation was happening. And there's a huge, it just kind of exploded. And people keep coming back to it and sharing it whenever the idea of a general strike comes up again, which is constantly because we need one. But, that's an example of, how it's not just trying to reach the public, it's trying to deal with editors who maybe also don't have that kind of knowledge and they don't have that kind of interest. If someone's like, what's the difference between a strike and then a different kind of strike? It's like, yeah, whatever, it's the same thing. Like, it is not. Even coming down to, things like that, like fighting over language. I had, from the other publication I don't like as much, I had a whole knockdown, drag out fight because I had, the word just transition in a piece about the climate crisis and about, us surviving this as workers. And they took out the just part, and I was like, no, that's a thing. Like, trust me, just because you're not following this and you're not reading labor law and you're not, this isn't your beat, like, please just trust me. And a big part of doing this kind of work in places that aren't necessarily, like, staked out as labor or lefty spaces means getting editors to trust you, to be like, okay, you're the expert, or at least you're trying. You know more about this than I do. Like, I'll let you get away with it. We'll see what happens. And I haven't screwed up yet. So, touch wood on that.
Thank you.
Kim, I want to now invite you to ask the people on either side of you some questions.
Right. Ashley, since I feel like you almost answered this already, but we were talking about how, essentially, what are we missing, right? Like, when you're talking to the media about all these stories, like, what are we screwing up, and what should we be asking that we're not, to make sure we're telling this in the most, honestly, beneficial and fair way to the workers who, all these things are happening to?
Yes, I honestly think that the media just misses, again, who the union actually is, right? Like, they paint it like the union is this big, bad, ugly thing that's coming in and making workers do things that they don't want to do and taking control from the boss, even though we do take control from the boss. But it's the workers that are like, this is what I want. This is why we want these things. And then I think the biggest thing that they miss is that, especially for public service workers, is that when public service workers have unions and they have a say in the conditions and services that they provide, the public benefits from that. Right? So, we here in the state of Nevada, the workers that we represent, they're the case workers. They're the ones who, one of our committee members, he works with the blind population, helping them to find jobs, helping them to be able to better, express themselves. Things that the general public don't think about unless you have a family member, someone that's blind. And so that's what the media, I think, is really missing. And, really, we need to get that message out even more, that it's not this organization coming in and changing things. It's workers saying, I do the work every day. I know it's better going to benefit my clients. I know it's better going to help me provide services to the general public, and I know it's ultimately going to make Nevada, as they say, a great place to live and work, right? That's the workers. So that's what I think is we're missing.
That's really good advice. Thank you. And you. So I'm glad that you brought up, that perception when you're organizing as a New Yorker of like, oh, these are white collar workers, like they're not going to care about this idea. And you've written for some really prestigious, like kind of highbrow places, the New York Times, the New Yorker, all these places about labor and workers issues. Have you dealt with that sort of editorial firewall? Like, how do you use this kind of class dynamic when you're pitching stories and writing stories for this specific audience of like, the New York Times isn't exactly the Nation, right? Like they're not the most working class friendly establishment paper, but you're doing it, so how?
Sneaky socialism. No, I don't know. I think actually we're in this kind of amazing moment right now where even like very mainstream and like center-left places have to pay attention to what's going on, and if they didn't publish stuff on the movements that we care about, it would just be bad coverage, like inadequate coverage. I might probably at the Times opinion page be slotted in as one of the more left-wing, contributors, so maybe they just come when there's something lefty to say. But I think one way to think about it is maybe like connecting movements and campaigns to larger ideas. So for instance, I covered the Arizona teachers strike for The New Yorker, and the animating question of that story, it wasn't just like a kind of narration of the strike, but it was centered around the query of whether teachers are still middle class, and whether teaching is a middle class profession. And I think like at those sorts of publications, they like to be high-minded. And so if you connect like a narrative to a larger theme, sometimes you can kind of explore, say what you want to say, but like in a slightly different framework.
You gotta trick them. Basically, that's what
Maybe
I do too.
a little.
Or be strategic and smart, like you all are. So I had a couple more questions for you, but you've all kind of touched on one of them. So I was going to ask you one, and then I want to cue everyone to be ready to think about questions you have for any or all of our speakers. So my final question to you is. You're talking to a room full of people who agree with you, and there are, I'm sure, people learning some tips and suggestions from you, but they generally agree with you and share a general viewpoint. Who do you feel like outside this room is one of the most important audiences you think really needs to get this stuff to kind of move toward where you think we need to go? I know that's a big question, so it doesn't have to be the only audience, but like a really important one.
I'll say for myself, like something I'm still trying to figure out is how to take all of this renewed energy and interest in labor movement and all this white collar organizing and translate that into more robust coverage of traditionally blue collar professions, more like looking at transit workers, looking at automotive and manufacturing workers. Like that's kind of like the world I grew up in. And there's a million pieces about, BuzzFeed or Kickstarter organizing, which is fantastic, but there's less coverage of like, a transit worker strike in DC, or even the GM strike. Like I went up to where I last saw Tammy, the GM picket line in Langhorne, PA, that got a couple local mentions, but they were kind of left out in the cold because I think there's sort of maybe the new generation of labor reporters that I guess I'm part of. Like a lot of us don't have that kind of connection or not part of that community, so it's a lot easier to report on like a publication organizing or a public service workers situation organizing than going into like going to the South and being like, why have we not organized this one chicken factory my friend's been working on for 5 years? Like, I think we just need to be, we're reporting on working class issues. I think we need to keep class in mind and make sure that when we're looking out for the whole working class, we mean the entire working class.
So I was just very glad that Kim is a part of Team Vogue, because for us, I think that there is a very, even though there's a lot of social justice and grassroots movements that are just growing in general, catching on from college-age children and students and beyond, I still think that generation or that group of individuals really don't necessarily connect social justice to labor unions. And so having this conversation with them and connecting those dots, because out of labor unions come all of these other social justice movements as well, right? And so having that conversation and making sure that they're able to be a part of conversations like this one.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. And I think also in racial justice spaces that I've been in as like an activist and writer, it's also the case that like labor, when you introduce it, is sort of like, oh, but that's not about racial justice. But of course it is, right? And immigrant justice. And then just professionally, I wish editors like saw more of this, because of all the explaining you have to do like in an article that reaches the public, I actually have to do way more when I initially pitch a story to an editor, because I have to educate them about what I'm talking about and why it would be a sellable piece.
And actually, I have a follow-up on that for any of you, but I'm looking at Kim and Tammy in particular. So I think you both gave some kind of suggestions around some tips for like know who the writer is that you're pitching, right? Know what they write about and what they might be, how they might be interested in covering it. Is there something additional that, like, could we also be thinking about that? Like, we have to help you make the case to somebody who doesn't get the issue, and is there a way to do that effectively? Besides just saying, like, here's why I think it's really important. Right.
Something that is helpful for me is when people are pitching me specifically for Teen Vogue, they'll mention an angle for a younger audience or like a non-male women audience. Like they'll be like, this is why we think your readers would care about this. And I do appreciate that, because it shows that they know who they're pitching and they know the publication, where it's not just like your email is on a list of people who write about stuff and they're just going down there. I know it takes a little bit of extra effort, but it gives me so much more ammunition to speak to that editor and be like, look, this is why our readers will care. Like, it does take a lot of like finagling sometimes to be like, no, I know it's just another strike, but here's why it matters. So there's like a kind of it's a double burden, explaining to somebody who's above you, making more money than you, why it matters, and then spreading that out to the rest of the world. So yeah, tell us, I guess, why it should matter we know why it matters, but why would somebody who's making a bunch more money than us think that it would matter?
I think the only thing I would add is, unfortunately, we are in a time where federal politics are really important. So if there is any sort of like federal legislative or political tie-in, that's always just super useful, because that's kind of what the news cycle thrives on.
Yeah. And I said I was going to turn it over to audience questions, but I have one question for you, Ashley. As you think about the coverage that you've gotten for this particular campaign and hopefully the ongoing coverage, have you noticed, like, have members seen the coverage and seen, like, oh my God, we're getting talked about, and look, it's out there? I guess either positive, like, it's great we're getting coverage, or like, oh, they're getting it wrong. And what's the reaction like?
Yes, so it definitely has been both ways. It's been almost a double-edged sword, because now they're like, we should go to the media about everything. Mm-hmm. They did this, let's go to the media. They did that, let's go to the media. The public needs to know. So it's been a double-edged sword. But I think one of the things that we've really tried to do here that was really helpful, kind of going to Kim's point, is figuring out who are the reporters and publications that are more friendly towards us and pitching our stories to them. And so we haven't had too much of it getting wrong, besides the whole, this is going to cost the state billions and millions of dollars and things of that nature. But really going to those people that we know they're going to pitch it, and then having our members ready to answer questions and be the face of those stories. So it's been a lot less of AFSCME is saying this, and this is a member of AFSCME that's putting this story out. And then members are starting to want to do op-eds and things of that nature. So hopefully we're continuing to move in the right direction, and we'll continue to have these working relationships.
Yeah, that's great. We loved having Stephanie, your member, yesterday, to talk about like what an impact, like how significant the campaign was to her.
And that's the story we're trying to get out.
Yeah. We have a couple people on the sides with microphones, and I'll let you all choose.
Hi, how's everyone doing? I'm Sarah David Heidemann from the National Women's Law Center. Hello, and thank you all for being here. I am curious about, as people who care about the labor and workers' rights movements and want it to always have a positive spin in the news, how do we responsibly cover things that we would like to change about our own movement? I think we have an inclination to want to keep things all in the family. And we also know that if we don't cover those things, sometimes someone who really hates labor will. And so can you talk a little bit about that, about how you think about that, and what you would suggest that unions or worker centers do in moments when they're trying to work through rocky waters and there might be press?
Sure. I think actually your instinct is probably right, that some of the journalists that you've developed relationships with, whom you trust, like, could also be trusted with thorny stories, and they are probably going to find out anyway, as you say, right? So, I mean, I guess I can give you an example. I mean, actually the slide that I showed, this 24-hour home care story, there was a kind of a big conflict with SEIU in that story, because a lot of the workers who were being represented by SEIU, you know, and thank goodness, because the contract really did elevate their work, still were not being compensated for half the day that they were working, and they were mad. And I think SEIU didn't love that I was reporting on it, but it was out there, and like a worker center was litigating some of that stuff. So I think like speaking frankly with some folks you trust, and, you know, trying to emphasize like the good that is underneath the bad is sort of probably the best you can do. And I actually think it is worthy. I think like we do need to also criticize ourselves and put some of this stuff out in a productive way. I don't know if that helps, but.
If you love something, you're gonna wanna make it better, and even if it hurts a little bit. I think I haven't done as much reporting in this vein because I'm a little more Pollyanna-ish. I'm trying to show like the world, here's all this good stuff we're doing, which I probably should work on. But my friend Hamilton Nolan, who's a veteran labor reporter, he's done a really good job of this. Like, he's been digging into the AFL-CIO for a while and coming up with a lot of really important stories, and I'm sure they just love him for it. But it's because he wants the movement to be stronger and better and more just. So I think, you know, maybe that's where a little bit of that objectivity comes into play, which I think is a fake concept, but sometimes can be useful. Even if it's just something as small as reaching out for comment or adding an addendum like, okay, everything isn't all, you know, puppies and rainbows. Like, nothing is perfect. We're all flawed humans. It's a flawed movement, but we're trying to be better. Like you were saying, trying to find the underlying good under perhaps a less positive situation.
And have you all dealt with this?
I'm taking notes on this portion myself. So, yeah, I would echo what the two ladies have just said. I haven't, in myself, here yet been in one of these situations, but I'm sure that when it comes up, I'm going to reach out to now my two allies here and figure out how do we best, you know, put a spin on this where it really is objective, but also looking at what's the good that's going to actually come out of this, or that part underneath. So I'm glad I have two allies now to really talk this through with.
Great. Thanks for the question.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm Megan Marcelin from Just Leadership USA. And I'm going to stumble through this question because I'm still thinking it through, even though you gave us plenty of time to do that. But in the spirit of the conversations we had this morning, I work for an organization that is led and run by formerly incarcerated people. And I understand, and because corrections unions were mentioned, I feel like it's important to talk about this, is I understand the complexities of that. I literally live in Weeksville, Brooklyn, where one of my neighbors has been at Rikers Island 4 or 5 times since we've lived there, and the other is a CO. However, I think about how we begin to change the narratives of spaces like corrections unions who are brutalizing people every day in prisons and in jails, to begin to put racial justice first, because everybody said racial justice is at the forefront of unions. I'd say some unions. And so how do we begin to challenge unions that do not have that lens, are not thinking in that way, and are complicit in the brutalization of Black and brown bodies, to think differently about their role in their work?
So I think that is a very good question, and as a Black female under the age of 35, I totally understand exactly where you're coming from. One of the things that when I started off talking about this, and I know that as for our union AFSCME, we had a whole racial justice forum that we had to establish, because we do represent a lot of public sector workers, and then we have those who are Black and brown mothers that is like the people that we're a part of our union are also on the other side causing a lot of harm and whatever to people, our sons, right? And so one of the things that, and I want to just back just a little bit, is that I've gone into a lot of prisons working for AFSCME. What I have come to find that in a lot of these prisons, the people who are prison guard are women of color, which is not something that's actually out in the public right now. The other thing that I have found is that most of the COs that are entering into these prisons are asking for training. They're asking for how do we do certain things, where they're coming in, they're giving 3 weeks of training, which is supposed to be in most cases 8 to 12 weeks, and then told go, deal with the situations. And so coming in as a labor organization, we're saying we're not here to raise wages and things of that nature. We're here to say, how do you properly train and equip an officer to deal with certain situations and circumstances, which is not happening, which causes a lot of harm to the inmates as well if we're gonna have a real conversation. So putting ownership back on these institutions to say, you're not even training people to deal with these situations and circumstances. So we've had to create within AFSCME like a CO's Bill of Rights, meaning we need to be adequately trained before going out into these different circumstances. Here in Nevada, we have 8 different prisons that we represent. One of our COs who is working in a prison that's severely understaffed, basically beaten to the point of losing his life, came and testified before our assembly in order to get the bill passed here, saying, I'm here because I want to make sure that what just happened to me doesn't happen to the rest of my coworkers, because those are also the stories that are not being told in the media, right? We hear the stories, unfortunately, of when things are happening to inmates, but then when they're happening to the people in the prisons, we don't hear those stories, right? And we also don't hear that because 4 people called out that this officer was now responsible for overseeing 400 inmates by himself, right? How could I can't do that. It's one of me and 400 inmates, anything can happen. So making sure that those stories are also out and being told, and making sure that the policies and procedures, the training that officers are going to need, how do we adequately help inmates? Is there really rehabilitation that's going on? Asking those questions when we're sitting down, negotiating contracts and things of those nature as well, is also something that we've found to be extremely important, sometimes even more important than the wages, because the workers here are like, the wages aren't that important. It's these policies and procedures. It's our training. It's how can you stick me with a cadet that just came out of the academy for 2 weeks? Like how? And so those are a lot of the questions and conversations that are happening as we're organizing correction officers as well. So I totally understand, and it's not perfect, and we're trying to figure out how to really do a balance here, because correction officers need to be protected, but also those inside need to be protected, and Black and brown people, of course, need to be protected. So just trying to figure out where that balance is. And again, I know for us, we've created a whole system forum to actually deal and address those type of questions and concerns, because it is a reality of what's going on within a lot of unions. So that's where we are, and still a lot of work to be done, but we're starting to have those important conversations.
I don't organize prison workers, but I just wanted to follow on that by acknowledging that there are probably a lot of people in this room who are prison abolitionists or something very close to that, and want to imagine a world in which we actually don't need prisons. And I'm wondering if the storytelling of that, like the story and the imagining of a world in which we actually have the CO population doing other jobs that actually nurture and raise up our communities, can coexist along this kind of reformist path that we just have to do because that is the job of AFSCME. And I don't know what the answer is, but I feel like we can travel down a reformist path and a revolutionary path at the same time in our stories.
Thank you for the question and for the very thoughtful responses. We talked a little bit before, and I knew somebody in the audience would ask that question, so I knew I didn't have to pose it. So thank you for raising that. Judy.
Hi there, I'm Judy Conti from NELP, and love this panel, and thank you. And I don't have a question, Kim. I have something I want to say to you, and I want you to take it back to your colleagues, and it's a message of gratitude. I have 11 and 13-year-old daughters, and we read your articles, Teen Vogue's articles, together all the time. You don't assume that teenagers aren't interested in important things. You don't dumb down your reporting. It's challenging for them. It's challenging for me. I have so many friends who share Teen Vogue stories with their teens, boys and girls, not just girls. And routinely when I share stuff out on Facebook, people will write things like, Teen Vogue is doing the best reporting and the best commentary of anybody these days. So just thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I also want to just stand in solidarity, let me stand up, with abolition, because I think it's lopsided, and I have a problem with the being overly sympathetic to the militaristic policing, whether it's correction officers or whether it's New York City's finest or Mississippi's finest. Disproportionately, those who are caged are victims of brutality. And we might as well not try to see that as an equal thing. We shouldn't see it. It's not true that prison guards are just as impacted as those who are caged. There's a mindset that goes along with being a policeman, whether you're in the corrections field or whether you are on the beat, on the street, or in the military. There is a mindset that goes straight to protecting property and not people. So factor in the fact that people who are incarcerated do not even feel like they're human. And we have represented workers who see nooses in their workplace and have been victimized by Klan members inside the workplace, and often the union will not take up those issues. And we have to accept the fact that unions need to come into the 21st century and identify harms and address them instead of skirting the issue. So I'm not speaking to anybody in particular, but it fell on me to say that because that's why we're for abolition, because the policing systems from the correction house to the jailhouse, military house do not work. All they do is cage people. There's no rehabilitation, and there's no protection for those who are the most vulnerable.
Thank you for that. And I wanted to ask if anyone wanted to comment or respond.
I agree.
No, what I want to say is, again, as a Black and brown person, I think that the conversation starts with, and unions, I think I want to echo my sister Tammy here, that one, we exist to protect the workers who have certain jobs, but the conversation does need to begin around, I agree, a lot of Black and brown people, one, that are in prisons and are in jails and X, Y, and Z, are there unjustly, right? So that's where this conversation also has to start. I'm just being honest. But at the same time, as a person who works for a union and a person who has a job there, right, they also should be able to go into a place where they're able to work and feel as though they also have a better working conditions. So that's the only thing that I was saying here, right? Our correction officers should feel as though if this is the job or the profession that I've chosen for a plethora of different reasons, what are the working conditions that I'm actually walking into? Because a lot of people that I've talked to as far as COs, this wasn't the job that they decided to take. This was the job that was available, right? And so when we go back to looking at, again, one of the places that I absolutely hate and that we actually have correctional officers that are working is down in Louisiana, Angola State Prison, which to me is a modern day slave plantation, right? Just 100%. And when I go in there and I see mothers who are correction officers that say, this is the only job that I can get in Louisiana, and I'm driving also from Mississippi, because for a man in these states, they can go and work out on the oil fields. They can go and do these things, but as a mother, I have to provide for my child. And so as a union person and as a person of color from Georgia, for me, if this is the job that you're taking to provide for your child, then you should have a decent, livable wage that you're taking home to provide for your children. You should be able to know that when I go into work, I'm gonna come back out of work, and that my children are gonna have a parent there with them. And so for us, for me, that conversation of making sure that whatever work that people decide to do, that there's dignity in the work and that they return home safe. And so that's the position that I take from the union, to make sure that all workers have a living wage, have a place to go home to when they get off of work, and have better working conditions, regardless of what the job is.
Hi, so my name is Dua. I'm with 1199 SEIU in Maryland and DC. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you for this conversation. This has been very helpful. I guess this question is for all three of you, and I feel like you've touched on it a little bit already, all of you have. When you've got long campaigns that are taking time, and you know, there are issues that keep arising, and you want to keep alerting the media and keep your workers in that conversation in the public, what are the, I guess, best practices maybe from Tammy? What things worked when you said, you know, I always want to go to the media for everything? What things actually stuck where the media did come out when you were doing that campaign? And then for Tammy and for Kim, when, you know, you've got a story that you reported on, and Kim, you actually mentioned the ATU workers that have been on strike, right, that are still on strike, and that was a big story, and then kind of the story fades. How do you keep the stories from fading? What things can we put in bold in the press release, or what hashtag should we put on Twitter to make sure that people continue to talk about these types of situations for not only union workers, but for, you know, these types of campaigns that run regularly?
This is a big problem, right? Because not every strike is over in a day or a week. Look at the Spectrum workers in New York. It's been like 3 years they've been out, and it's hard. Like I'm coming to this from like my music business background kind of comes into play here, right? Because it's like you have a new record coming out, and yeah, you do like. There's a big PR push the first month, and then crickets for the rest of the year. And how do you keep that going? Like, band goes on tour, band does interviews, band does this and that. And I know it sounds a little funny going from heavy metal to labor, but I mean, I do it every day. But I mean, if you're looking at, you have like a big exciting thing happen. You had a strike authorization vote, and you had a strike. And then you went on strike, and then it's been 3 weeks, and there haven't been any new stories. Because, you know, the person that wrote about it, like, oh, here's my story, and I'm going off to write about whatever else is going on. And I think the way that you can keep engaging that media attention is to sort of look at it like, it's kind of gross. Look at it kind of like you're selling the story, right? Like, what angle can I take to email this person? Like, does this worker have a specific, like, have an especially interesting story? Like, did the boss pull some real bullshit the other day? Like, what new things can we put out there? Also, do not send like 4 emails a day. Some unions do that, and I wish they would not. But look at it like, yeah, I mean, like, look at it kind of like you're promoting a record. Like, there's the big splash, and then, like, how do you keep interest going? Like, what's happening behind the scenes? Maybe a writer, this publication covered it, but maybe a writer somewhere else hasn't. What are they interested in? What angles do they focus on? Is it, like, an immigrant justice situation? Is there a racial justice lens? What can you use about your situation to kind of pull in those eyeballs? It feels a little crass to have to sell a story like this, but the media is a terrible place, and we only have so much space and time to do stuff, so you kind of have to like lure us in. And those are things I think would work. Like, that's what keeps me interested. Like, I'm always keeping an eye out for new stories and new updates, because I have like 3 labor columns, because I'm a maniac about that. And there's always a new angle. There's always something happening. Even if the story is, we've been on strike for 6 months and no one has written about it. Well, why haven't they written about it? Like, there's always something you can kind of pick out and send it to the right person, and it'll turn into a story. It just takes some time to identify and think about what that would be.
I don't have too much to add to that. I mean, I guess I would just say, like, to my earlier point about, like, stories in different shapes. I was recently in touch with a worker center that was trying to get coverage of a new campaign related to incarcerated workers, and you know, I think they were trying to pitch one thing as an op-ed, and then they also were in touch with a long-form magazine writer who was going to write like a 5,000-word piece, and so the op-ed was going to come out in like 2 weeks, and that was going to come out in 2 months. So they were kind of thinking about like, what is the lifetime of this story, and what are the different boxes it can be sold in, and then also, you know, and they were also creating their own content. So I mean, another thing is you probably can't expect like one reporter to stay on one campaign forever, you know, just because of the demands of the newsroom today. But you can also train and mobilize your own folks to do their own PR, and that will serve different purposes than traditional media.
Yeah, and just to echo a little bit of what Kim was just saying, I know for us here, one of the first stories was this is the first group to file for recognition after collective bargaining has passed. We have 8 other groups that we're going to be filing. So instead of pitching this as the first group, here we're also waiting for the rules and regulations to be established in Nevada before we can actually be certified, even though we have filed for certification. So we're going to file next week, and the story is going to be now thousands of workers are waiting on the state to actually do rules and regulations to certify these different filings. So making sure that we're continuing to just give different portions of that story to make it a little bit more interesting. Well, why is the state still stalling? There is, a good 5,000 workers that are now have filed and said they want their union, and the state still has not done that. So just giving different portions of the story. So it's the same story, but a different angle, if that makes sense.
Yeah, little individualized surveys instead of just here's the whole thing.
Right.
Yeah, we call them scooplets.
Okay.
Yeah.
Scooplets.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay. Good afternoon. This is very informative. My name is Mark Philpart. I work with PolicyLink. Just really appreciative for the level of complexity you have offered for this conversation. One of the things that struck me as someone who is a self-identified abolitionist, working in the legislature, trying to advocate for policy through reform pathways, realizing that the biggest challenges that we faced in California, at least around some of the bigger criminal and juvenile justice reform efforts, have really been because of labor opposition, specifically thinking about the way in which labor, let me just be specific too, because it's not all labor, it's really specifically, probation associations, and correction officers, and I get the arguments being made about, ensuring those individuals have quality jobs, but being in a situation where they're also very much protecting the status quo is a very hard place to be in. And I'm also a pro-labor individual, so I wonder if you can talk about how AFSCME or other unions you may be connected to are thinking about this notion of just transition to a set of jobs that aren't extractive, aren't exploitative, aren't being built upon the kind of mass incarceration of Black and brown bodies. And I think that more conversations like this throughout the country need to be had in a very open forum so that we can kind of collectively come to some agreement around how we want to move forward as a society and as a community. But I wonder if you can just give some insight into whether these conversations are happening and how they are unfolding in your organization.
So I can't speak for all other labor unions. I can only speak for AFSCME. And so one of the things that I will say is that, because again, we recognize that this is a very complex issue, and I will be the first to say that. I know one of the things that we have found more often than not is that a lot of these stories are out of private prisons that are for profit. So some of the things that we have done here, and not just here but across, is supporting legislation against private prisons and things of that nature. When we are sitting down to have these conversations, we're making sure that COs, probation officers, the general public is involved in the conversations that we're having from our Social Justice and Racial Equality Forum, and I hope I'm saying that name correctly. This is a focus of that conversation. Unfortunately, I'm not in that group, but that group is made up of people of color, those that are in law enforcement, those that are doing some of the parole and probation. We don't have a lot of parole and probation members within AFSCME just because of the nature of our makeup, but having those conversations and trying to come to a place where we're making sure that, again, that the rights of those people who are incarcerated and those who are, quote unquote, I guess, the correction officers, making sure that things run smoothly in the prison. Like, what is that conversation? And is there an intersection where we all can come to some type of resolution? So it's a very complex conversation. I'm not the person to speak for all of our union or for corrections on behalf of that, but it's a very complex conversation that, is being had on a on a regular basis, I can say that. And so here, again, one of those things is just banning private prisons, because again, that's a lot of where a lot of mistreatment, a lot of not just of the inmates, but of just a lot of things are happening, right? So that's where we're starting the conversation. Where this conversation is going to end, unfortunately, I don't know, but I can say that for now.
I will just say, as also an abolitionist, I think the labor movement is at a point where it needs to have some difficult conversations about what kinds of workers it wants to stand in solidarity with. I will say that my first column for the New Republic was called "Abolish ICE's Union." So this is kind of where I'm coming from, and I absolutely respect you very much what you're doing. Just from my specific viewpoint, like as an abolitionist, as an anarchist, I'm not really interested in being part of a movement that welcomes like killer cops and ICE and people that are, causing untold misery and extractive horrors upon our fellow humans. Like, I think it's a difficult thing, right? Because we're a labor movement, there are a lot of different parts of that. There are very right-wing leaning unions who are a part of this movement, who are killing us, like killing our fellow workers. And I think, none of us have the answer. These are conversations that need to keep happening, but I think the labor movement is it's been a little afraid of getting into that because it's difficult and it's uncomfortable, but I mean, people are dying and we're supposed to be the labor movement. We're supposed to stand for the working class. Do people who exist as tools of the state count as being part of the working class? These are questions that I'm interested in talking about and, figuring out what we're doing. So, I mean, it's a matter of life and death.
Yeah, I just wanted to offer just an additional personal note, which is that when my mom first immigrated to this country, she joined the US military. And why did she do that when she's actually a person who doesn't share that politics and doesn't believe in US imperialism? It's because she had no money and she wanted to go to school. And so to me, that's like looking at my family's history, it's like, why did we have a society where those were the choices? And I think like the conversation we're having here about corrections associations, the conversation we're having about minors and climate change is like points to like a question of what does it mean to be a labor movement? It's not just about labor too, it's about like schooling and infrastructure and healthcare. And that's why I think like when we talk about Medicare for all and all this stuff, in some ways those are like the foundational goods that we need so that we need to have a world where your mother says, I have to take this job at Angola. And so, I think alongside this conversation of like, who do we stand in solidarity with, it's also like, how can we build a social infrastructure that enables better decisions and like more choices for how we support ourselves.
So we're a little past time, but thank you so much for the several of you in the audience who raised it, and for all of you for engaging with it. And Tammy, I don't think I could have wrapped up an unwrap-upable topic better than you. So I'm gonna leave you with the last word on that, but just really want to appreciate all of you coming here to share your insights, and for all the work to our media representatives, all the work you're doing to push the media to cover these issues better and more. So just, really want to appreciate it, and all the work actually you're doing in Nevada to get more workers the rights and protections they need on the job. Thanks, everyone.